My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good evening everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the other side of the globe, and welcome to another VLGA LGIU Global Executive Panel this evening on the topic of trust and culture in local government. My name is Chris Eddy. I'll be very pleased to be your facilitator for the interviews as part of this session today, and I'll introduce Catherine Arndt to you in just a moment, who'll be joining me to moderate Q&A as part of the session. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and beyond, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders, past, present and future, and to their cultures. And it just so happens that we're doing this session on National Sorry Day in Australia, and I just want to point out that I do have the native hibiscus, or the desert rose, on my lapel this evening. And just to tell you a little bit about that, it is a symbol of strength and resilience, and the colour symbolises healing. Chosen by the Stolen Generations people, this flower grows across Australia and reflects the resilience and strength shown by the people removed from country, language, culture and family. So just would like to acknowledge that on this National Sorry Day as we honour the Stolen Generations. Now, in terms of housekeeping, please keep your microphone on mute and preferably keep your camera on so that we can see that you're with us, and we look forward to having your participation in our session this evening. Before I introduce our panellists, I'd like to call on Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, to officially welcome you to tonight's proceedings.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this journey, I guess, as we learn more across a number of different jurisdictions about what trust and culture means for local government. Such an important topic, in fact, for all levels of government. And in Australia, of course, we've just gone through a federal election and perhaps seen some of the implications of elected representatives losing trust from members of the community. I'm really pleased that the VLGA is able to host yet another global panel along with our partner LGIU, and soon you'll hear from the head of LGIU Global, Jonathan Carr-West. But I'm also delighted to see and have with us a panel from panel members who are from also Victoria and also New South Wales, as well as the UK. I'd like to acknowledge the VLGA's president, Councillor Denise Massoud, who's in the room, and also all other councillors who might be joining us this evening. We do have over 40 people registered, so I assume that a few more will be joining us as we go along. But anyway, I'll hand back over to Chris and we'll kick off the conversation.
Trust and culture in local government. It's a topical issue. We thought it was topical in Victoria. It's topical everywhere, actually, at the moment. A number of states around Australia are conducting reviews of the local government sector, not just on culture as we're experiencing here in Victoria. And in the reading that I do from week to week, I've noticed this is an issue in the UK, it's an issue in the US and right across the globe. Having said that, the local level of government seems to enjoy the highest level of trust when it comes to levels of government. So perhaps there's something there to be protected and built on as well. They're just some of the themes that we'll explore today. The public trust doctrine is the foundation for the legitimacy of public institutions and a functioning democratic system. And this evening we'll hear about a couple of different situations where trust has broken down and has needed to be rebuilt. Before I go to our first panellist, I want to acknowledge that we do have Dr. Jonathan Carr-West from LGIU, who's a published author on this topic, the topic of redressing the trust deficit. I just want to quickly say hello and welcome to you, Dr. Carr-West. Thank you. We also have Sue Weatherley, who's the Director of Business Strategy and Innovation at Georges River Council, which underwent amalgamations of a number of pre-existing councils not that long back, and the issue of trust has been well to the fore in that community. Hello, Sue, and welcome. Nice to have you with us. And my first panellist this evening, someone I know very well, and you will too after a few moments if you don't already, and it's Lydia Wilson, who's the Chair Administrator at the City of Whittlesea and an experienced local government CEO in her own right. Good evening, Lydia.
Good evening, Chris, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Just to set the scene a little bit, the City of Whittlesea is one of a small number of councils in Victoria that have had the body of elected representatives removed from office by the Minister of the Day for what I loosely term as governance failings. What this has led to is a need to rebuild trust, not just with the community, but also within an organisation that has had something like 6 CEOs in a 3 to 4 year period. Lydia, you've been charged with leading the team of administrators through this period or this journey back to elected representatives in 2024. And I want to ask you, when you came in as interim administrator, where did you think you needed to start to deal with this issue of a breakdown in trust?
Thank you, Chris, and good question. But could I maybe just preface my comments by saying that I think there's a general decline in trust across all 3 levels of government in Australia. And obviously that extends to local government as well. And there's also a lot of social media and a lot of press that has come towards that. And I think the immediacy of social media playing out some of those issues has, to a certain degree, exacerbated the situation. So I must say, when I was appointed, which was in March 2020, I was an interim administrator for 90 days. And it was quite a daunting task because the whole process of restoring good governance at the City of Whittlesea, stability and creating a roadmap for the future was obviously a very big task. And I wasn't sure what would ensue after the 90 days. However, we got through the 90 days, and obviously you can't do a huge amount in 90 days, but it was about that presence of the good governance, and particularly about ensuring staff in particular during that time that there was stability. I was fortunate enough to then be part of the continuing panel of administrators. So we've been appointed through to October 2024. So it's a lengthy period to really enable us to restore good governance at the City of Whittlesea. The reputational issues that come with the very public dismissal of the council and a municipal monitor's report, but also importantly to set a clear roadmap for the future and a lasting legacy. And obviously to do the restoration of the reputational issues. So I think that there's some differences in relation to the way that we've dealt with it for staff and the way that we've dealt with it in relation to community and business interactions. In relation to staff, I think from the outset, we had to adopt a tone where we were modelling certain behaviours and values. And it was really clear that we needed to show one another as a panel of administrators mutual trust and respect, and model all of those basic values of integrity, open and honest communication, creating a safe environment for staff, because we had staff coming into obviously briefings and council meetings. They needed to feel reassured that it was a safe environment. We also needed to create a positive and optimistic outlook for the future. We made a very, very conscious decision that we were drawing a line in the sand, and it was not about looking back, but it was really always looking forward and painting that really positive outlook going forward. And I think staff particularly appreciated it because it was a sense of optimism for the future. But we did have to allow sufficient time for staff to heal and to vent if they wanted to. And that's something obviously with the CEO and his executive leadership team that they dealt with that side of things. We modelled really positive relationships, not just between the panel of administrators, but with the CEO and the executive leadership team. And it was about unity in purpose. We were one team working in partnership for the community of Whittlesea. And we were prepared to call out any inappropriate behaviour. We were prepared to deal quite openly with any conflict, but in a really positive and proactive way. And importantly, we were always well read, interested and well briefed when we went to briefings and council meetings. And a lot of that was really just to restore the confidence of staff. In relation to the community, it was slightly different because we've also got within the Local Government Act the focus on deliberative engagement. And it was really very much about finding a whole range of different ways of engaging with the community, getting out and about, flying the flag, and making sure that we involved community in everything that we did, opening up council meetings and changing some of our governance practices.
Lydia, can I jump in with a couple of questions? I want to come back to that community angle in just a moment, but it's just occurred to me when you're talking about the need to rebuild the culture, the trust within the organisation. You actually had to appoint a new CEO, didn't you? That's a pretty significant decision at the best of times, let alone at a time in an organisation's history like this. How cognizant were you of the need to really get that decision right from a trust and culture point of view?
Chris, you painted the picture that Whittlesea had something like 6 CEOs in 5 years, including interim CEOs. So it was a critical decision, and that was virtually one of the first things that we were tasked with, was to appoint the new CEO. We needed to be so mindful of what were some of the qualities, the background, the skills of the new CEO at a time that we needed somebody at the helm who would stabilise the organisation, but also could be an important conduit to our community and business sectors. So it was a huge undertaking and one that we didn't take lightly. We have got a best practice CEO Employment Matters Advisory Committee with an independent person, and they were involved during that phase of that recruitment of our new CEO.
And just on community, before I let you take a rest and we bring in a couple of the other panellists, the representative role of the elected representatives is well known and understood. The role of an administrator stepping into that position in terms of representation to the community is not as well understood. How, or you might correct me, how do you go about that part of the role and getting the community on side, I guess, with having administrators in place for such a period of time?
Thanks, Chris. I think that's a really excellent question. I say often that we're not just a board of directors, that we've got a dual emphasis on good governance, but equally we have to play a representational role. And I say that because we very consciously have focused on not wanting the community of Whittlesea to feel disenfranchised by the fact that they have got administrators in place. Secondly, in relation to our appointment, we have been appointed to assume all of the roles and responsibilities of the council. So our interpretation of that is one part of it is good governance, the other part of it is all of the civic duties and all of the representational roles equivalent to all normal councils, and the only difference has been that we're not democratically elected. So we've really tried to push on the engagement, the civic events and the direct involvement with residents and ratepayers of the city.
Thanks, Lydia. So much more to talk to you about. I'll let you take a breath. And I want to bring Sue Weatherley into the conversation. Sue's the director at Georges River Council. I think you're wearing 3 hats at the moment. You were telling me, Sue, 3 different director roles. It's so busy
We've
times.
just had a bit of a significant change in the leadership of the organisation. I think 2 directors and the CEO all left in the same week. So I've taken on 2 of the other directors' roles as well as my usual one. So, but yeah, don't ask me how I'm managing. That's all.
Well, there's that old saying: you give a busy person something to do, and they'll get it done.
Absolutely, that's right. And I'm just learning out what's important at the moment.
So you're at a council that's not that long back gone through an amalgamation process, bringing in some pre-existing councils into this new entity. I want to ask you about the trust issues that might have come with that, and some of the members of our audience will remember back probably nearly 30 years ago now, that whole amalgamation process in Victoria, which still gets raised by parts of communities around the state. But there's an elephant in the room I want to get out of the way first, Sue. Just announced yesterday the ICAC investigation into some of the former councillors from Georges River. When we're talking about trust, to have this sort of come out of the blue, that must be an issue for how your community perceives their council, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is it'll be a huge challenge for us over the next little while. You know, I suppose we're somewhat grateful that they're former councillors. They were councillors on, 2 of them were, all 3, because there's one who has never been a councillor at Georges River, but the 3 of them were all councillors on the former Hurstville Council, which was one of the entities that made Georges River. So it's an interesting time for us. I'm not sure where this will all lead. It's not just an issue in terms of, community trust back into the organisation. It's also the trust that other entities may have with us. The state government might look at us. It'll also be how this impacts on as Lydia's pointed out, it's an issue about has potential to impact on the whole organisation, particularly at the time when we've had a substantial change in our leadership group as well. We've got an acting general manager. I'm sort of acting in a couple of other roles. So we've actually got a lot of change at the upper levels, and then managing our reputation as a consequence of the ICAC inquiry, as well as numerous other things that are just happening in local government. And I think, it may be also well known that one of the mayors of another council in Sydney is also subject of an active and current ICAC inquiry. So the potential for this, I'm not quite sure where that leads, but it is one of those ongoing problems, I think, in New South Wales, the sense that, how trustworthy is the planning system, and a lot of people don't have trust in the system. The community doesn't have much trust in it. Some of that's based on the fact that it is the most complex and hard to understand planning system anywhere. I defy anyone to possibly design something more complex and opaque than the New South Wales planning system, and try and explain that to people and how you get involved. Yeah.
That's an issue, though, isn't it? How can you expect people to trust something that they can't possibly understand without having a degree in such things effectively?
And if you just start with the representatives, so like the councillors, and how much faith can they or trust can they have in the system that they struggle to understand. So it is a few years ago, as post the amalgamation process, the government did introduce independent planning panels as a way of putting the councillors a bit to one side in the planning process, allow the independent planning panels to determine applications and advise council on what to do with planning proposals, which is planning scheme amendments. I've got lots of different terms across Australia. And so they have a role to play in that. And that was intended to build confidence in the system that planning matters would be considered on their merits without undue influence and everything. And then we have another inquiry which involves former Georges River councillors and former Hurstville councillor. So it's I think it's a significant issue. The state government has tried several times to do major reform on the planning system, and it almost always fails. They can tweak at the edges, they can make minor changes, but any significant reform has failed almost every time, simply because, almost exclusively because of this lack of trust. The community doesn't trust what the outcome might be. I'd rather have the bad outcomes I've got now than potentially something's even worse, and therefore they've been very resistant to change. I have to say the planning panels have been a success. They are moving us in the right direction. They're giving us a sense that applications would be considered on their technical merit and not necessarily on as a consequence of any influence. They haven't completely resolved this issue that you can't possibly understand the planning system. And if you don't understand the planning system, it's hard to have faith in it. Yes. It's hard to understand, why that decision was made, when sometimes it's hard to explain how all the different planning elements work in New South Wales.
So that's one issue, isn't it? The community's ability to trust the system, but there's also an issue that you and I have talked about briefly between the local level of government and the state level of government. Is it fair to say that the level of trust between the two levels of government also leaves something to be desired?
I've been working in government in some form, generally in local government, for more than the 30 years you quoted, because I just finished working in Victoria when Jeff Kennett was elected Premier, and he did all the significant changes both in the public sector and local government. So I just moved to Queensland. So I do remember those times, but only as an observer rather than a participant. And so the issue of my whole career, I've never felt that there's a strong relationship between local government and state government, and even at the federal level. There's always a sense that, can we completely trust them? Are they reliable? Will they deliver on what they've promised? And I probably could give dozens of examples where partnerships have been established, but those partnerships, either expressed as an MOU or some other document, don't survive not even the next government, sometimes doesn't survive the next minister. Or ministers change priorities, and some project you're working on jointly with another government agency suddenly is not the priority, and they're not going to put the money into it, and you can't keep running with it without their support. And I'm sure state government would express the same sort of views about getting involved with partnerships with local government as well. And in New South Wales, the state government sets housing targets and says you've got to come up with planning instruments that will deliver that many houses. And that's always seemed to be an imposition on the local community. So the local community doesn't trust the process. Councillors hate that, and there's no really strong relationship between the state government and the local government, and there's this lack of trust. They're not necessarily there as our partners or trying to work with us. It's a sense that they're working against us. Now, that's not completely true. So it would be, I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying that's the sense, and as a consequence of that, it's hard to build ongoing, sustainable, really important relationships when people aren't entirely trusting of either the process or the people involved in that process.
Am I right that there was recently a release of data which was used to demonstrate which councils weren't meeting those housing targets? And I imagine that data must have come from the state, would I be right?
Yeah, and if anyone follows me on LinkedIn, I had an absolute, just try the right word, I went a bit mad, partly because...
Weren't impressed?
No, I wasn't impressed, and the two, for several reasons. The way in which it was expressed is that the councils had failed to meet their housing targets. I'm sorry, councils don't build one house. We don't build any dwellings. Our job is to present planning instruments that have the capacity to deliver that many dwellings. If that many dwellings aren't being delivered, so the housing targets aren't being met, then that's an issue about state government working with councils and the development industry to understand why. Yeah, it's not a case of the failure of local government. And I'm absolutely certain that's how it was being expressed out of the department. Councils have failed to deliver on their housing targets. That we will be measured going forward on housing targets. We can't be held responsible for investment decisions of the private sector. If they've paid too much money for land, then they can't make they can't make it profitable to build a 5 or a 6-story apartment. They should have, you know, how can we be held responsible for that? But that's how we are positioned, and it's our failure. Whereas the housing system, and that could be a whole new seminar for someone else to talk about the complexity of the housing system, and local government's only part of that. We are not. It's not our failure, but that's how we're presented. There's no wonder local government goes, you know, we really want to work with the state government. That's how they're going to present our actions and our outcomes.
Yes, it doesn't help build trust, does it?
Absolutely not. And there's more than one example like that where you go, yeah, okay.
All right, so take a break there, and I'll bring in our third panellist, Dr. Jonathan Carr-West, the CEO of LGIU. And Jonathan, we'll rely on you to tell us a bit about LGIU, as well as if you could talk to us about this concept of the trust deficit, which is the basis of the chapter that you wrote for the Rutledge Handbook of International Local Government.
I mean, I think it's really good to be talking about this today, because this issue about trust is one of the most profound challenges we face, and we don't, I think, talk about it clearly enough. So LGIU is a not-for-profit that operates a global network of local government. We try and share best practice, support and stimulate innovation, bring people together to talk about problems. We work with over 300 councils around the world. We launched LGIU Australia a couple of years ago, working with our partners at SGS Planning. So we see these issues, you know, up close at a global scale, you know, and we see that very similar things are happening around the world. And the reason we talk about a trust deficit is because we know that if we want to face, you know, to tackle some of the really complex challenges that are, well, I was going to say are coming down the track at us, that are already here, whether that's climate change, whether that's caring for an aging population, whether that's equipping kids with the right skills to operate in a changing digital economy. All of these things, you know, our responses to these have certain characteristics in common. We know we need to move towards demand management rather than sort of acute intervention. We know we need to co-create solutions with service users and with communities. We know that we need multi-agency, joined up, preventative approaches. And we know that, you know, as I said, that we need to be working. We can't, that's not something that the state, whether at local level, state level, national level, can do by itself. It needs to operate, and we heard this from Lydia, it needs to operate in collaboration with communities. But the essential currency for doing that is trust. Trust between, within the institution, trust between the institution and the community, and trust within the communities. So we've got this essential currency of trust. But at the same time, we have a crisis of trust. And we see declining trust in big institutions, not just institutions of government, media institutions, big brands are reporting the same thing. They don't see the same levels of brand loyalty. And in the context we're talking about, declining trust in government. And that's quite acute and quite profound. And we could talk later about some of the reasons behind it. But just to give you some sort of examples of how big a challenge that is for our democracy. So recent research in the UK by IPPR showed that 4 in 5 Britons, 4 in 5, felt that politicians didn't understand them and weren't acting in their best interests. Research we did at LGIU around local elections showed that about half of people didn't really understand how decisions were made in councils and what the role of elected members were. Some of the best research on this internationally is from some guys at Harvard, Yasha Munk and Roberta Foer. And they showed declining trust in democratic institutions across advanced economies, some of which is quite shocking. So less than 1/3 of Americans born after 1980, so less than 1/3 of youngish Americans believe that it's essential to live in a democracy. Wow. Nearly as half young Americans think that a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections would be a good thing. Yeah, we saw this is a particular problem amongst young people. We saw people in their 20s and 30s supporting Marine Le Pen overwhelmingly in the French elections last month. 72% of adults in the UK say that the system of governing needs fundamental improvement. 54% of them back in 2019 said they needed a strong leader who was willing to break the rules. Might be an example of being careful what you wish for. And these trends are global. So if you look at Munk and Foer's data in Australia, It's not quite as bad as in the US, but it is going in the same direction. So they also track the percentage change of people who say, actually, I'm not sure democracy is such a good idea. Well, maybe a strongman leader would be a good idea. Not increasing as fast in Australia as it is in the US and the UK, but still increasing. So, there's this fundamental challenge around trust. So at the very time at which to meet the challenges we have coming at us, we need more trust, we have less trust. So that's why we talk about a trust deficit that you've got, which I think is a profound challenge, because it will stop us doing the things that we need to do to meet those 21st century challenges. And that will then become a sort of vicious, people will then see government failing, councils failing, and it becomes a vicious circle. Now, Lydia was right to say earlier that, or maybe it was you who said it, Chris, that the councils are more trusted than other parts of government. But I think, that's quite a low bar.
Yeah.
So in the UK, the local government association say, well, it's okay because 6 out of 10 people trust the council. Well, actually, that's still 4 out of 10 that don't. And secondly, I think we need to kind of, and this work I don't think has been done enough, is really unpick that. What does it mean to trust the council? So, I trust my council to come and pick up my bins. They'll do that every Wednesday reliably. Do I trust them to look after my granny? That's a different question. Do I trust them to accurately kind of give life to the sort of aspirations and fears and needs and desires of the community I live in? That's a different question again. So the question of what trust means is quite complicated, but without it, we know that we won't be able to meet those really crucial challenges.
I'll just remind the audience that we'd like you to start popping your questions into the chat if you've got particular questions, and I'm sure all of our speakers have generated some thoughts in your mind. In terms of that issue you've just described, and some pretty scary statistics there, I've got to say, that you've shared with us, Jonathan, where do we look to for examples of best practice of dealing with this trust issue in our public institutions?
Well, I think we do look to, this is the good news, is we do look to local government, I think. So I have another version I have a speech that I call, why local government will save the world, because I think it is locally that we can start to address this. Because when you promise something and deliver it at a local level, people see that you've done it. So in national politics, that's all pretty abstract. The government will say, oh, unemployment's up, or unemployment's down, or GDP's done this. You don't know. When your council says, we are, these houses are going to get built, or we're going to put in place these care systems, or this new school is going to get investment, you see what you can see that. The leadership is more accessible, it's closer to you, and you can hold people to account more easily. So I think that local government is where the action is in terms of fixing this. I think there's 4 things we need to do as councils to do that. I think firstly, we have to really think about narratives and how we reframe narratives. I think we have left too much to sort of populist negative politics. I think we need to really think about how we tell the story of the places we live in and how we engage with communities. And we do have a tendency sometimes as organizations to think, well, if the community doesn't trust us, that's because they just don't understand how good we are and what we're doing. I don't think that's good enough. We have to really engage with what the community actually feels and thinks and get into their narrative. We have to start, and this is why local government is so important, we start with place, because those big questions about what sort of society we want, they actually become much more concrete in terms of place. What do the people who live here now aspire to? How can we live together effectively? What's the relationship between this place and the wider world? What are our priorities and aspirations? You can do that at place level. It's very hard, and you've just had a set of federal elections. We've got constant political turmoil in the UK, all of which illustrate how hard it is to have a national dialogue about the direction you want to go in. But it's easier at a local level. I think we need to act like more like networks and less like institutions. So we focus, and again, Lydia reflected some of this, as did Sue. We focus relentlessly on the outcomes for people and places, not on our own institutional processes and structures. And we can be quite guilty of that in local government. Let's face it, we are quite an institution. But actually, we all talk about that, but are we really doing it? So I think you really need to sort of sweat some of the small stuff. So we all talk about, we're an outcome-focused council. We're focused on, we want people to be agile and learn and make mistakes, fail quick and learn and all these things. Do we actually support that in the way we manage our staff, in the way we appraise their performance, in the way we manage their careers? Yeah, there's some boring stuff, you know. How do your appraisal processes work? Yeah, you need to sweat that stuff, sweat the boring stuff to get that kind of more networky effect. And then finally, and I was really pleased to hear Lydia talking about this, because I think this is the most important thing. You need an uncompromising focus on participation and on dialogue in everything you do. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways to do that. Lydia talked about something, citizens juries, you've got participatory budgeting. You get great examples of that in Australia, Melbourne, a decade ago, doing a massive participatory budgeting process. You've got good old-fashioned town hall meetings. There's all these tools out there, but you really need to commit to them and invest in them. And it's exactly what Lydia was saying earlier, that bringing that the community into every stage of that journey, being really open, really transparent, being willing to say when you don't know, trusting the community to sort of be part of that decision-making process, and trusting that people will, even if they get an outcome they aren't happy about, if they can see the process and they see the trade-offs and the dialogue and the sort of decision-making, that's how you build trust. So, and I think we can't, it's very hard to do that at the national level. We have to start local. And that's why, local government is at the forefront of this in two ways. We are right at the sharp end of a trust deficit hampering what we do in a way that, frankly, it doesn't hamper national government quite so much. So we really suffer from that trust deficit, but we are also in pole position to start to address it.
Jonathan, just before I sort of open it up for cross-panel conversation, you mentioned negative politics, and I know you were here in Australia until a few days ago as our federal election campaign wound up. I think, and I've heard some people say, one of the more negative campaigns on the whole that they've seen. And you've just come through local government elections, haven't you? I wonder how negative that was, and whether these pieces of the political cycle set us back further in terms of that trust deficit.
I mean, I think it's difficult. I think the short answer is yes, they do, but they're also, but elections are pretty fundamental. Look, elections are not the whole of democracy. And I think that's really important, that democracy is an ongoing dialogue about places and about sort of people's role in shaping them. But elections are a kind of fundamental foundation. They're a necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy. So I think, in a sense, that they do sometimes. I think there are some 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Yeah. I think they do sometimes set us back a bit, whilst also moving us forward and giving people a sense of agency. Certainly, we saw in the UK, and we fight against this very hard at LGIU. But it is fair to say that the recent local elections were very much fought in the shadow of national politics and precisely of issues around trust. And, do we trust the people who made our rules through COVID to obey those rules? Do we trust them to operate in the best interests of the community as we face a massive cost of living crisis? So yeah, I think that was a big factor in elections here, as it was for you in Australia.
Thanks, Jonathan. Now, we'd really like to see some questions coming from the audience for our Q&A panel. Catherine?
Thanks, Chris. Well, that was just, really enlightening. And Jonathan, I know you mentioned that defining trust and what that looks like is complicated. And I wonder, when you spoke about those statistics of the younger generation, particularly in the US, thinking that perhaps, moving away from democracy, or at least part of it, might be the way to go. And then reflecting on the election process we just had in Australia, and also the local government elections over in the UK, could an element of that be simply just exhaustion of, citizens? And therefore that exhaustion is translating into that position of, well, perhaps the democratic process isn't the one to go because of all of those things that are happening around it, particularly at election time.
Well, look, I think that's certainly a factor. It's best summed up in the UK by a very famous clip of a lady called Brenda from Bristol, who was caught on the news, and when told there was going to be a general election, just went, "Oh no, not another one." And suddenly, it feels that it's been a pretty battering couple of years in terms of politics. For us, we've had Brexit, we've had lots of political turmoil. We've then, as you have, we've all had the pandemic to get through. So I think there's an element of that. But it is also notable that when you look at that research, it's much stronger in young people. So when you talk to people in their 70s, how important is it to live in a democracy? 2/3 of them say, yeah, it's absolutely essential. So, one explanation of that, I don't know if it's the right one, is that people who sort of grew up in the sort of the shadow of the Second World War, the Cold War, where sort of where autocracies were genuine sort of threats, are more invested in democracy, and younger people are not. I think it is also to do, though, with the way in which, and this is a whole separate sort of thing, but it's this shift from institutions to networks as the primary way in which we sort of organize and think about the world. So an example of that is if you think about how people get news. So traditionally, people got news through so if you're in the UK, you get it through the BBC, or you guys might get it through ABC or whatever, and you have a sense of what the institution means in terms of sort of editorial processes, journalistic training, codes of conduct, governance, etc., that enable you to place trust in it. 75% of Americans, and it's the same in the UK, I don't have the stat for Australia, but I bet it's very similar. 75% of people now get their news primarily through social media, which means that instead of it coming from an institution that you trust, it's coming from a network. So it's being shared by people you know. That is fundamentally different. And so I think, yes, it's exhaustion. Yes, it's a kind of a plague on all their houses. Yes, it's sort of contemporary events. But I think it's also driven by some quite profound social and technological changes that aren't going to go away.
And of course, though, the digital technology or digital governance is also an opportunity, perhaps, to address some of those, those issues as well. In fact, we're moderating a panel at the University of Melbourne's Digital Governance Conference that's coming up next week on this very topic, and that is the use of technology to assist with that participation that you spoke about in Lydia and also Sue. And I wondered if Sue had any reflections, particularly through the New South Wales local government elections last year. I think they ultimately were an in-person election. Was that correct? You didn't go to the online, or have I got that?
I think it was a combination of online. You could vote online, and it was the first time we've ever done online. It crashed.
Yeah.
And they're the sort of things that actually, we talk about trust. You set up an online system and people have no faith in this system, and it did crash. And for a few councils, there was some problem with the way that votes were then counted. So it's led to the potential that those elections maybe have to be re-held. So technology is a wonderful opportunity for us to engage, but it has to be right. And talking about the messaging as well, my current role included reputation and communications engagement. And sometimes our role was we were communicating something, telling people what was happening. And other times it was managing the message, simply because, the ICAC inquiry at the moment is a good example of that. We have to be very careful about what we say. We can't be completely open on those conversations for lots of reasons, mainly legal. We're not supposed to speak about those things. So doing that in a way where people say, oh, I understand why that's the information we're being given, as opposed to them just saying, oh, that's just been, and it's meaningless. So we can get out there relatively quickly with messages and have a really good take up on our Facebook for messages and information to the community. Really successful during the period of the worst of the pandemic. We were a hard lockdown area in Sydney, very locked down, and the community were very grateful for the information we had on our website, and that built a lot of kudos with our community through our Facebook posts, etc. But yeah, it is a double-edged sword. Done badly, there's a lot of cynicism to it. Done badly, people won't believe it. But done well and engaged well with the community in the manner they want to be engaged with, it can be a great success. And we did get a lot of really good benefits out of the way in which we engaged with the community during the worst of the pandemic. So I think Lydia was going to add something to
yes,
that.
Lydia, I'm conscious Lydia's been wanting to jump in for a little while, so Go for it.
Thank you. But my comment was not at all about social media. I just wondered if I could go back to a couple of comments that Jonathan made that just so resonated with me. It's about that leadership role of local government in regaining trust, and he particularly commented about accessibility, engagement, co-creating solutions and multi-agency partnerships. I just wanted to then talk about some tangible small things that we've been doing, which has really created quite a lot of impact. So we changed our governance rules because previously members of the public could come in and attend council meetings, but there wasn't any interaction directly. We would read their questions, we would read their responses, we'd read their petitions, we'd read a response. There was no direct interaction. And a simple thing of changing our governance rules to enable people to come in and actually present their own questions, present their own petitions and joint letters, really, and unfortunately we then got caught with the pandemic, so that wasn't able to occur in the same way, but that's now embedded in our governance rules. But the other thing that we're about to further embed in our governance rules, and it gets back to Jonathan's point about placemaking, is that we're now going out 4 times a year for a community forum, followed by the community-based council meeting. We've got the direct interaction with our residents and businesses. And we've most recently started a monthly coffee with council where we move around to local cafes and we publicise we're out and about. Come and talk to us. You've got any issue, you've got any concern, please come and meet us. And the last one we had amazing interaction from members of the community and business with some critical issues that they wanted to raise with us. So there's so many things that we can actually do that are not onerous to really genuinely improve our engagement with residents and businesses.
Thanks, Lydia. So you'd like to add to that?
I was just going to really make the point that, thoroughly agree with Lydia's comments about, we have an opportunity that other levels of government probably don't. We are in that position where we can speak directly to our community far easier than anyone else. We have all the infrastructure necessary to do it, whether or not it's drafty town halls in the middle of winter or it's a nice coffee shop or whatever. We actually have infrastructure that supports our capacity to get out to our community and speak to people. We don't perhaps use that enough. And when we've put that effort into that process, the community will feel heard. And there's lots of examples. I was a bit negative during my opening remarks for lots of reasons. But I sometimes miss some of the positive stuff, that capacity actually to meet with people and speak with people. We run some of the similar things that Lydia was talking about. They are not always highly attended, but that's not the point. It's there because we're saying, well, we are accessible. If that's what you want to do, our council will be this weekend, for example, the ward councillors will be in their ward available to speak to people. And like many councils, and organisations, we've had to adjust what we've done during the pandemic. And while online can often seem impersonal, imagine if you're elderly or you're infirmed or you have a disability, which means you can't leave your home easily. Suddenly we're a lot more accessible as well. So there's been, the learnings out of the necessity of the pandemic to do things differently also means we've opened up other channels to be able to get to people where we wouldn't have thought to have done it before. Oh, no, we can't do it that way. We'll have a meeting. Well, now we can say, we can have an in-face meeting, but also we'll run a couple of online webinars. We'll do something else. And people almost expect that now. And so that's really helped us change that around.
Thanks, Sue. I think we're about to go to audience questions. I just want to pick up that conversation about the iVote system, and Sue's right, there were I think 3 councils that had their results thrown out in the Supreme Court and have to go back to election within the next couple of months, I think. But importantly, I think this sends a signal. The Electoral Commissioner has advised in New South Wales that iVote system will not be used for those elections and will not be used for the next state election, which is coming up next year, because they're having to rebuild it, basically. So you certainly wouldn't want to be using a system that's tainted, because the trust levels would just drop further, wouldn't they?
Oh, yeah, that's right. And
No
I would say the trust in the system. If you can't trust the democratic process that my vote will count, it's really hard to trust the results. So it's not surprising that the future of iVote's now challenged, but it made a big difference. I have elderly in-laws in their 90s. They could vote because they could vote iVote. They wouldn't have voted any other way. So trying to find a great solution to that would be excellent.
All right, Catherine, let's see if we can bring in some audience questions.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Chris. I did want to get back to at some stage the panel's view as to whether or not trust in local government was or increased as a result of COVID and people being in their community, living, working, breathing more so than perhaps they would have ever been before. But before we do that, I'll go to the panel, to the audience questions. There's a question here from Maria asking how the panel would advise navigating the local conversations. And we touched on this, particularly the housing issue, where some of those bigger issues are actually being settled nationally or at a national and state level, and where local government really have minimal levers to change those policy decisions, but of course have a very important role of implementing them, and also therefore being in receipt of and responding to the community response to that.
So I might just nominate Sue, because you sort of touched on this issue where the state's setting those targets and sort of holding councils to account for delivering them with limited capacity to actually influence, Sue.
It has two elements to it. It's the being held accountable for the outcomes, even though you can't really be accountable for the outcomes, where an input, and that is zoned land suitable for development. That's the council's role, not to actually directly deliver the housing. This is a vexed issue, and I'm not sure that I completely have the solution. I can tell you some of the things that clearly haven't worked, and there is partly a leadership role for local government in this. There's one thing, we have a job to listen to what our community has to say, but we also have a job to lead as well, and to do that in a way that says that, yes, there is a housing crisis in Australia. Do you want your children and your grandchildren to be able to afford a home or even have a home? And if we do, we've all got to work together and find a really good, be part of a bigger picture solution. It's that type of conversation local government needs to have, rather than being the reaction that we will oppose what the state or the federal government's doing. It's about trying to make sure we have a seat at the table. Now, it's interesting, the National Cabinet, when it was established and replaced the COAG, it doesn't have a local government representative.
Yet.
I'm just going to say it doesn't have a local government representative, and I have no confidence that it will. In fact, it shouldn't just have one local government representative. There's all the states of Australia have a local government association. My argument that each local government association should be represented at the National Cabinet in some way. We actually need to be part of the conversation, and part of the thing, the leadership role that the council, local government can play, is to say, we have to be part of this conversation. You have to include us in these conversations. You can't just impose housing targets on us and then almost blame us when the housing supply is constrained. We have to be part of a conversation about the whole housing solution. And that, I think, is part of that leadership thing. Not whinge and complain that, the housing targets are being imposed on us, but be more bold about saying, well, we have some solutions. We need to be part of the bigger conversation.
The other key, I think, is individual councils not doing it on their own. I think that there's power in the unity, and something I've certainly found from the different regional associations is that we're much more successful and we're just so much more powerful when we work in unity across regions, across certain segments of local government.
Jonathan, looking at your jurisdiction over there in the UK, how is local government's voice represented to your national level of government?
Extremely imperfectly. Poorly, and increasingly poorly. So we have a local government association which has that role. That has a complex structure. It's very political, so it has different political groupings within it. Its political leadership is determined through some unbelievably arcane formula that no one quite understands, to do with who has the most council seats. And then it has a sort of a process of decision making that kind of gets consensus from all of those groups. And then they meet once a week with the Secretary of State for local government, and he largely ignores them. It's a constant frustration, and it's something that has become much more acute over the last decade. So we've had a Conservative government for since 2010, a coalition and then Conservative. One of the really striking features I find is how often I'm talking to Conservative council leaders from big, what you would think of as big, powerful councils, who you would think of as real stakeholders, incredibly frustrated that they just have no voice, that they have no way into government. And you're sort of thinking, it's a bit of a different setup. These are your foot soldiers. These are the people who are going out indoors and knocking through the political, and yet they have no access through. So it's a huge challenge here.
Why is there this reluctance and it seems like the jurisdictions are quite similar with these issues. Why is there such a reluctance for sort of the state and federal or national levels of government to really respect local government as the service delivery arm of many of the services that they in fact fund? But we're delivering it to the communities for them.
Although I think that's, in a sense, that's part of the problem. So one of the challenges is that local government is lots of things. And so yes, but precisely the problem is that they think of us as a service delivery arm, not as a set of sort of sovereign democratic bodies who have their own legitimacy. I think, the cynical view on this, I remember Francis Maud, who was a cabinet minister here a few years ago, sort of once cynically sort of drawing it. The thing is, everyone believes in devolution, that they just believe in it to exactly the level that they sit at. There's a thing about power, there's a thing about accountability. There's a genuine thing about accountability. We have a media culture in the UK, and I think it's pretty, well, maybe it's not quite the same in Australia, actually, because you have state government. But national politicians know that they will get it in the neck from the newspapers when things go wrong, and so they worry about the accountability. And you look, Peter made this point in Peter Mogridge made this point in the chat. There's just this kind of belief amongst national politicians and civil servants that they know best. We are the clever, sort of high achieving national people. Surely those little people in local government can't. I remember once sitting in a meeting with the Treasury here, and they just said, well, tax is far too complicated for local government to get its head around. So there's just this sort of patronizing view that it's a mistake. I think one of the mistakes that one of the traps that clever people often fall into is to underestimate the cleverness of others and to assume that there's no other cleverness out there.
Jonathan, would you mind, for the Australian audience, just very briefly explaining what devolution is and what that might equate to for us?
Sure. So devolution has been a process, a much talked about and partially delivered process in this country, whereby where national government, so we don't have the state level, national government starts to hand down powers to councils or to sub-regional conglomerations of councils. It's very, very limited. So it's people like me get very excited about it. You say, well, look, they've got this great devolution program back in 2015, and now the leadership in Greater Manchester can make all the decisions about sort of bus franchising in Greater Manchester. And you sort of think that's great. But if you tell that to someone from Paris or Berlin or New York, they'll be like, well, that's crazy. Who did it before? Oh, some bloke sitting in London 300 miles away, which in our terms, 300 miles is a very long way. I know for you, that's like down the road. But so it's been this process of sort of giving more kind of economic and infrastructure development power to local government. but it hasn't gone as far as genuine sort of fiscal devolution, no tax raising powers, limited spending powers. 98% of tax in the UK is still driven entirely from central government.
Catherine, I'm mindful of time. We'd like to get perhaps another couple of questions in.
I can see that Peter has his hand up. I'm not sure if that is, if Jonathan addressed your question then, or over to you, Peter.
Yeah, no, it was just a comment really, I guess to be charitable, because I always like to be charitable, that inevitably if you're at the national level, the view that you have and the things that you can do, you have a different agenda than from a local level. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. I guess looking at the COVID thing as an example, what they had to manage at a national level was very different from what needed to be managed at a local level. And so actually some of the mechanisms and tools that and processes that need to happen necessarily need to be different, because they are actually operating in a different way. And we can argue where the boundaries between local and national, etc., should be, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. And as an example from Shetland, we have virtually no political parties on the council. We've just had the election. I think this time around there are 3. All the rest of there's only 22 of them, but the rest of them are all independent. And last time around, I think there was 1 SNP member, Scottish Nationalist Party. So that's very different from the national level, both at Edinburgh and in London. So I think that what's the word, that kind of scoping is important in discussing some of these issues.
It raises another issue, doesn't it, about whether more or less political party involvement at the local government level corresponds with higher or lower levels of trust. Sue?
Look, I was actually just going to comment on that issue of there's an imbalance, a significant power imbalance that often puts local government at a disadvantage. And one of those in Australia, of course, is the vertical fiscal imbalance. That, you know, we don't have great income generating capacity, but we have lots of responsibilities, and we're often given new responsibilities without necessarily any suitable increase in our revenue. And it is always a bit of a sore point in local government about that relationship with the state and the federal government, as well as state government having grants and which might be given to the local MP, available to council, which may not necessarily be about things that the local community has had as a high priority, but it's a priority for the state government, and suddenly that's the project that's being funded and delivered. And I think there's just not enough recognition of the role of local government to deliver some of those local infrastructure projects, and making sure we have sufficient money to do so. It's, you know, it's a bit of a apply for a grant, hope you're going to get it, and all those sort of things. It's a bit like, it's a level of control, it's a financial control that puts us at a significant disadvantage in any conversation about broader policy and bigger policy issues, because we just can't get a big enough seat at any table to have a big enough influence.
Thanks, Sue. Really good point. Catherine, perhaps time for one last question?
I haven't seen any more come through in the chat.
There is one more there you might have missed, from Andrew, who's asking whether a lowering of the voting age could help to restore trust, particularly with the next generation. Do the panel have thoughts on that?
I think that's almost certainly true. We do have voting at 16 in Scotland, not in England. I think you could go further. So there's a political theorist here in the UK, a guy called David Runciman at Cambridge, who argues for reducing the voting age to 6, which sounds insane when you first think, but the more you think about it, the more sense it makes. We have, you know, one of the challenges and one of the things that degrades trust in politics for young people in particular is that it skews so heavily towards older people, because they're such a large part of the population. They're getting larger. If you want to balance that, you need to go the other way. We don't apply any kind of tests to older people. You know, you never lose your vote, so why shouldn't you gain it earlier?
Lydia on this issue, and then Sue.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't going to comment so much on the lowering of the voting age. I was just going to make a general comment that I think that historically young people have been the group that has traditionally not been as engaged with councils for a whole range of reasons. And at the same time, that's where I think there's some positive elements associated with social media because, and the point was made by Andrew in relation to the discussion on social media. So it's become a vehicle where we've also at a council level been able to engage much more directly with young people. It's been a really valuable tool in relation to those discussions. So that was more my comment.
Yeah. And I thought we might have spent more time on social media, but Sue, yes, your thoughts?
I was going to just make this an observation of a colleague. Her 21-year-old daughter offered a slight variation of the lowering the voting age, suggested if you can't vote for the first 18 years of your life and you're voting for things that will have a future impact on you, perhaps you can't vote for the last 18 years of your life. So if the average lifespan, say it's 88, because that's a nice round number, then you can't vote past 70.
That's an interesting theory.
And I actually thought, hey, actually, that's not too bad.
Jonathan, your thoughts on that?
I think I prefer the idea of giving things to people than taking it away. So I would rather give the, I mean, maybe don't go to 6, but go to 10. I mean, give me any 10-year-old. They understand issues. They have a mind of their own. I would say give the vote to 10-year-olds and let people in their 70s and 80s keep voting.
Here.
Yeah. We might leave that there. It does remind me, and Catherine's just popped a link in the show notes about a conversation we'll be having next week as part of that digital governance conference. Catherine.
Yes, that's right, Chris. On our panel, we have speakers from academics from WA, from Western Australia, from Portugal, New South Wales, but we also have a young man on our panel. His name's Leo, 14 years of age, who established, I think, back in 2020 now, if I recall him saying to us, Chris, the other night that as a result of the pandemic, they had questions, he and his friends, and he set up a sort of through social media, an online platform, and he's very much engaged in all levels of politics, I would say, and had an outstanding leadership role to play, representing his cohort during the recent election in terms of talking with the elected representatives directly. It's a great story.
He even got an interview with the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister now. All right. Thank you to our panellists for, I think, a really enlightening discussion. Lydia Wilson from the city of Whittlesea, Sue Weatherley from Georges River, and Dr. Jonathan Carr-West from LGIU. That's been terrific. Thank you very much. Catherine, I might throw to you for some closing comments.
Thanks, Chris. Look, it's always a pleasure to host these discussions and hear from a variety of different speakers, all of whom are outstanding leaders in their own right and in their own jurisdiction. It's the VLGA's pleasure to be able to deliver this program along with LGIU to a global group of participants, just talking about, in a very sort of informal way, the issues that are facing our sector. And it's just great that we have, people like yourselves taking the time out to hear about the issues that are really important so that we can continue to deliver services to our local communities. So I thank all of our panellists, and I thank Chris, our host for this evening, and wish you all a very safe rest of the day or evening, wherever you might be.
Thanks, Catherine. And there will be a recording of this discussion tonight made available through the VLGA's VLGA Connect channel on YouTube, as well as through LGIU. So look out for that link to come out in the next few days. Just leaves us to say thank you to you all for being part of this evening's session, and wish you all the best, and we'll see you again soon. Good night or good morning to our friends in the UK.